What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detailed Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Shelf Appeal, the show where I go over the comic books that I picked up this week, give you my impressions, let you know whether there's something you should go back to the shop for or not. To start off with, we're going to talk about Dark Horse's Ether number 2 by Matt Kindt. So this is a book that's continuing on with the story of Boone and his travels between the regular world, the real world, Earth, and the Ether, which is kind of like this magical, mystical place, and he doesn't really believe in magic. He's a scientist at heart, and he's exploring this other dimension, so to speak. In the first issue, we were treated to the death of the Blaze, the protector of the Ether, so it's Boone's job as an outsider to track down who was the actual villain behind this, and we see some really cool developments as to how Boone's process works, and how he interacts with the people of the Ether, which are inherently magical and fantastical beings. We also get some backstory to the Guardian of the Crossroads, those kind of things, a little bit more backstory on the Blaze herself, and this is really a surprising issue simply because the way that you travel to the Ether is not at all what I would expect. I mean, it's rather grim and dark, but it's really kind of interesting to see how it contrasts with the much more fantastical and whimsical world of the Ether itself. It's a book that I wasn't necessarily seeing myself being too happy about, but overall, Ether number 2, definitely something that's going to keep me on for number 3. Next, we want to talk about Spider-Gwen number 15. So this is going to be wrapping up a story where we see the reliance of Spider-Gwen on Matt Murdock, who in this Earth 65 universe is the kingpin of crime. He's the hand, like he literally runs the hand, he's the kingpin, and what we see is that Gwen is in a particular situation where her father's in jail for helping Spider-Woman, she no longer has her powers, and she's running low on her boosters. So this is a situation where Matt Murdock is kind of coming to her rescue. We do see the return of Earth 65 Cindy Moon, who is a Silk, another conspiring villainous entity, S-I-L-K, abbreviated, kind of like a shield of Earth 65, except bad. Jason Latour has been passing the time to try and get to a different arc, and what we see is a big crossover next time with Spider-Man and Spider-Gwen that's going to go for like 6 issues, 3 of each. So, I don't feel like I'm going to get a good, solid Spider-Gwen story for at least a couple months at this point in time, which is kind of disheartening. Then we'll bust over to Green Lantern, so number 13 came out, and this is it's not necessarily a conclusion of the Phantom Ring arc, but we do finally see what the Phantom Ring is capable of, since there's no control, there's no limits to its power and how much it draws from the emotional spectrum. And reality, it's not necessarily drawing from the emotional spectrum, it's drawing from the user itself, and that makes for a very interesting development for Frank Lipinski, as he may or may not have taken a little bit too much out of himself trying to control this thing. Overall, I really like the way that the arc's going, and it's going to transition into a little bit more Volthoom-based storyline. There was a cool kind of little bit of backstory with Raimi and the creation of the rings. So it's definitely a good book, but it's not necessarily delivering the kind of punch that I got at the first part of this arc, and it's probably one of those situations where after this is done, I might not pick up Green Lanterns again. However, a book from Young Animal that's continuing to surprise is Cave Carson Has a Cybernetic Eye number 3. So in last issue, we actually saw the origin story of the actual eye, not necessarily in detail, but we saw how Cave actually ended up with it. And now we're kind of seeing the capabilities, because once they're in the mole, the original mole vehicle, you've got Cave, his daughter, Wild Dog, and it's funny how she gets into the actual mole because Wild Dog basically blows up her car trying to take on this giant beast that's behind her. But once they actually make it into the Earth, we see some of the capabilities of Cave and his level of preparedness as they head into Muldrug. The problem I see is that the transition to Muldrug was really fast. So it didn't necessarily have the kind of depth. They could have taken a little bit more time, developed a little bit more of the backstory, concentrated a bit more on the characters, because it feels like, all right, cool, let's go to Muldrug, and then within like a page, they're there and things are all turned to shit. So it kind of lost me in that respect, but it's still something I want to keep along with, simply because I like the dynamic between Cave, his daughter, and then Wild Dog is just great comic relief in there while providing a little bit of support. Next on the list is Green Arrow number 13, and with Green Arrow number 13, we see the continuation of the Emerald Outlaw arc, where people, while some other archer in the heart of Seattle is kind of making it look like Oliver Queen's Green Arrow is going around murdering people that are speaking against him. A much darker version of vigilante justice and trying to silence the opinions of him and turn the public against him. We all know that this is kind of a masterminded plot by the CEO of Queen Industries that was kind of running the whole Inferno ring, all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting to see how everything goes. There's some really great moments, like you get to see that kind of perspective that Oliver Queen has on things, like why he loves Seattle and the people around it, and those are very cool moments that go along with it. And then there's some situations where it's just like, okay, do we necessarily need this part of the story? So it's losing a little bit of the power and the strength that I really found in the first arc, the life and death of Oliver Queen, versus where we're at right now. It feels like we're trying to figure out where he's going to go next and how that's going to impact the rest of Seattle. And it's playing out, but it's just not quite as strong as I would have really liked it. But overall, Green Arrow is still a pretty good book. Definitely a surprise coming out of DC Rebirth. Another book I was pretty surprised about was Nightwing. So Nightwing number 11 continues on with the Bloodhaven arc, and this is actually kind of cool because we see for the first time a support group for villains, at least in my recollection, recent memory. We see a support group for escaped or basically people that have done their time but were former villains, and they went to Bloodhaven to get away from Nightwing, and it was a super funny interaction to see these kind of supervillains in their costumes trying to get help and support by confronting who they were in a previous kind of life, so to speak, and then seeing Nightwing bust in and be like, oh my god, what's this? Oh, crap. I messed something up here, didn't I? Because he's really unsure of himself as well, which is kind of an odd take on Dick Grayson, but it's definitely something that kind of connected with me, and the first thing I can think of is just like, yo, Dick, it's like, you move on from Barbara Gordon so fast. It's just like, wasn't necessarily what I was expecting, but I really like where this Bloodhaven arc is going. It seems like it's really a lot of fun, and I think it's going to be a really good fit for Nightwing as a character, get him to stand on his own 2 feet continually in this DC Rebirth saga. When we bounce over to an independent book, it's going to be The Fix number 7. So The Fix is a pretty interesting tale from Nick Spencer with art by Steve Lieber, and this is going to concentrate more on Mac than it is on Roy. So if you're talking about the former partners in crime, literally and figuratively because they were partners as detectives, but he's got his dog Pretzels, and the only thing I can say is, no Pretzels! The end of the book was kind of like a heartbreaking, heartwarming situation at the same time, and you're probably going to see a tipping point for Mac, but it was really funny to see just how dull and dim-witted he kind of bumbles his way through these situations and how they all go wrong for him. In the same way that it goes wrong for Roy, but on a much different scale and scope, because Mac still has the opportunity to kind of like turn himself back around. He feels like he wants to be a good person, but he just happens to be kind of caught up in these things. And I really like The Fix. It's probably one of the better independent books to come out this year. It's really entertaining, so I highly recommend people go grab it. If you're into a little bit more offbeat, a little bit more brutal, kind of dark and dirty kind of comic book, really fun, but a little bit on the grim side. The next big book to talk about is Amazing Spider-Man number 22. So as the Clone Conspiracy goes on, Amazing Spider-Man has turned out to be the only real tie-in that has any kind of consequence or has any kind of factoring into what goes on in the main Clone Conspiracy Untitled. And this is really interesting because in this Amazing Spider-Man issue, we see the backstory of Ben Reilly. And we already really know Ben Reilly, he was a clone from back in like Amazing Spider-Man 142 until 160, that whole original Clone Saga, and then the Clone Saga again. He took over as Peter Parker for a period of time, and then he ultimately died dissolved in Peter's arms. And what we find is that this isn't some sort of alternate universe, Earth 94, Earth 95, Ben Reilly, which I was hoping for. Instead, this is a little bit more tried and true and dark and grim kind of take on what happened to Ben Reilly after the fact, because Miles Warren turns out to be an astonishing psychopath. So this is a book that if you want to follow along with the Clone Conspiracy, if you want to see the justification for why Ben Reilly is who he is, you definitely need to read this issue, and I'm probably going to go over it a lot more in the review that I'm going to do of this book. I don't want to spoil too many things, because if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, definitely go read it so that way you can kind of take everything on your own. But it became a must-read portion of the Clone Conspiracy, and I can't really say that about many of the tie-ins. A book that is almost always must-read, though, is Doctor Strange. So Doctor Strange number 15 continues along with the Blood in the Ether storyline, which takes a trip down the Rogues Gallery of Doctor Strange. And in this one, we're focusing on the Orb. So the Orb is a really weird character. Jason Aaron kind of brought him back in for Original Sin, and then he kind of obtained the eyeball of the Watcher, and he kind of has it embedded in his chest now, which is all freaky and stuff. But it allows him to see the secrets, the hidden meaning behind everything. So he just goes around watching. And he's like, oh yeah, just like the Watcher, I don't interfere. But sometimes I give people a little push as he runs a dude over with his car. I mean, it's just like, he is... I really enjoy this interpretation of the Orb, because he used to be just kind of like this funky, petty thief kind of guy. And this has just got a dark and grim kind of take on the actual position of the Watcher and how you could kind of manipulate it in the worst possible ways. Because he's just like, hey, it's like, everybody hates you. He's talking to some guy in his sleep. He's like, everybody hates you, there's totally all these bad things are happening to you. Why don't you show them what kind of man you are by killing everyone? And it's just like he just implants that little bit of seed to kind of facilitate these darker urges. So you've got the resurgence of Mr. Misery, as well as Mordo, and a whole bunch of other people as we finally get to the big bad of the whole thing, the ultimate villain for Doctor Strange. So Doctor Strange number 15 and Blood in the Ether are a really good story arc. Definitely a recommended read for everybody out there. Back on the DC side, we start talking about Superman number 13, which continues a trend of putting out little two-part stories for the Superman storyline. So we saw the In the Name of the Father arc, which was 2 parts dealing with, Robin and Superboy. And then this one is really more about Frankenstein and Superman and the bride, Frankenstein's bride, and a little bit of Lois and stuff like that. So this wraps that whole thing up. It's got a really kind of interesting romantic take on Frankenstein, his bride, a little bit more about the Shade kind of organization, and those kind of things. It didn't really do much of anything. It was just like an inevitable conclusion. There wasn't really any kind of twists or turns or things like that, and it was really all about the emotional journey that Frankenstein takes without really taking an emotional journey, and how that impacts the perception of Lois and Clark Kent, Superman, and how they kind of see their relationship in contrast to that. So it was definitely a good issue. It wasn't quite as strong as what I've come to expect from Superman, but you can't really fault it too much. There's a huge story arc coming up over the next several issues that's going to tie in a lot of different Superman comics, so I can totally understand just running these small little truncated stories right now just to kind of pass the time. However, in Trinity number 4, what we get is a continuation of a really solid storyline from Frances Manapul, and this is where we get to go to Themyscira. So Wonder Woman kind of, she understands that this is completely unreal. This is not something that's happening right now, and she gets to go back to her homeland. And it kind of continues an ongoing theme with Wonder Woman that she's never been home, but it's kind of odd the way that Frances Manapul kind of takes it in this respect, because there's no real timeline between where Wonder Woman has that realization and where they're at right now. But it's definitely a really good self-contained story between Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman kind of in this Amazonian situation, especially when there's already a young Diana on this island. So they go through these kind of Herculean, Amazonian feats and challenges to prove that they're worthy to stay here, but they ultimately get banished to the Darklands, or whatever it's called. And it's just a really good continuation of this story, and we finally meet the other big bad behind this, Mongol. So that's going to be pretty cool. Definitely an interesting book, and one that I highly recommend people continue to read, especially if they're kind of fed up with the Justice League arc. Trinity's always one of the better books from DC. And then another independent book I've been anticipating for quite a while is 4 Kids Walk Into a Bank number 3. So with 4 Kids Walk Into a Bank, we get Matthew Rosenberg and Tyler Boss telling the story of 4 kids that are trying to kind of rob a bank before her dad does, to try and save her dad and his dumb friends. And this is basically how 4 kids that are in, like elementary, like junior high kind of age, how they would go about robbing a bank. And they've got a really good idea. You've got your science person, you've got your kind of like tech person who's trying to break everything out, you've got your buddy who's kind of like an asshole, but he's like your asshole, and then you've got the leader who's got that kind of fierce passion and drive to kind of take care of these things. So there's a little bit of espionage, there's a little bit of tech, there's some pretty funny scenes because they accidentally develop a truth serum. So it's not quite what I was expecting. It's like, I think I had a preconceived notion of where this would be in terms of the level of quality, because I really liked, 4 Kids Walk Into a Bank number 1 and number 2. They were really great, but the kind of hiatus really kind of pulled me out of that. So I've got to probably read issue 1, 2, and then 3 to see how well that fits together in terms of, its strength and its power. So it's still a book that I'm waiting for. I really want to see where 4 and 5 go, because I think it's only a 5-part series. But 4 Kids Walk Into a Bank by Matthew Rosenberg, super fun little read, especially if you want that kind of like youthful but kind of dirty, violent comedy kind of aspect. Very cool book. Highly recommend it. Another book that I highly recommend is Black Hammer number 6. And Black Hammer itself has probably been one of the best independent books of the entire year, written by Jeff Lemire with art by Dean Ormston. And this is really cool because we finally get to see the origin story of Madame Dragonfly. And she is it is a prototypical kind of history of, say, a magical, mystical character that kind of gets trapped in her own situation for some sort of selfish purpose. It's really a pretty stampled upon trope, it's well trodden, but it's still super cool to see how she came to be in this perspective, and why she can't necessarily join in with everyone else that she's supposed to. She's kind of setting her own limitations because they were set for her, and she doesn't want to ultimately upset that kind of balance. However, she is kind of a mastermind of sorts behind things. She's kind of keeping the status quo as it is, so that's a really interesting concept, and I can't wait to see where they go in the annual and in the next iteration of Black Hammer. Black Hammer is a stunner, man. If you haven't been reading Black Hammer, I highly recommend that you go grab it, because it has been one of the best independent books of the year. Now we get into some highly anticipated continuations, and that would be Invincible Iron Man number 2. So this continues the story of Riri Williams as she takes over for Tony Stark, and this is really more of like superhero in training session. And I'm not going to lie, I have some problems with this comic book. Overall, I really like the continued development of Riri Williams' backstory, giving her some very strong emotional ties, some very strong emotional bonds to why she needs to be this character. But I found that they were a little bit too... You didn't necessarily need to throw that weight in all at once when it came to her actual story. And then when it came to the actual training montage, it's just like, okay, so she built her own armor, and then Tony Stark has all of these armors sitting around that he's going to use for training the new Iron Man in her inferior Iron Man armor. That just doesn't make any kind of sense to me, because if Tony Stark has uploaded himself into the computer as a potential IA, essentially a ghost in the machine, Tony Stark, he could basically become like his own Oracle Overwatch kind of character and manipulate this legion of Iron Man armor to go handle his tasks all over the place. He has an infinite network of information that he can really pull from in this frame of reference. You know, it's like he could become omnipotent, and he could manufacture all his own Iron Man armor. He could become one of the most powerful kind of like hive mind situations in all of Marvel. And yet he's using these Iron Man armors to train Riri Williams to become the next Iron Man. So that doesn't make sense. You know, it's just one of those things where it's just like, yeah, she's the future. Sure. Why don't you give her a new suit, man? Why don't you help her upgrade? Why don't we have... Dude, we could totally go Rocky on this thing. We could have had a training montage going through this entire thing. Essentially, it's just like she goes a little bit rogue. You know, she goes and borrows some parts from a former Stark building that just happens to be utterly destroyed, which makes me wonder where the Iron Man armor came from. But, you know, she could go into these situations and figure this stuff out and add these components and redesign herself and go Mark II, Mark III. You know, we could see an evolution of her Iron Man armor until she becomes a more capable superhero compared to destroying or, like, debilitating all of these other Iron Man armors in order to make her inferior armor better or make her a better hero. But yeah, it doesn't make a good jump for me, so it has me a little bit worried about the future of where this actual storyline is going to go. However, there's a book that I'm not so worried about, and that is Venom #2. So Venom #2 is pretty interesting because we get to see Venom in a capacity that we haven't really seen him as. You know, in Venom Space Knight and, you know, Guardians of the Galaxy and stuff like that, he was always his own individual character. He kind of became an entity that was fighting alongside Flash Thompson. But in this one, we kind of see, like, a devil angel on the shoulder kind of situation where he's manipulating Lee Price while Lee Price is manipulating Venom. He's using Venom's facilities and his capabilities in order to kind of enhance himself and kind of bring himself up the ladder. But when we see the interactions between Black Cat and Lee Price outside of the Venom situation, you know, he's brought back the case and all that kind of stuff, it's really kind of cool to see, like, this little ghostly Venom kind of plucking around these individual people, like, giving him advice, being the whisper in his ear, you know, the little voice inside your head, giving that some tangibility. I think that's a really cool concept for Venom, and I like the way that this is going. I like the idea that Venom and Lee Price are in a struggle. You know, the symbiote and Lee Price are in a struggle for control, and whoever slips up is the one that's going to be dominated. And right now, Venom just doesn't have the kind of strength to kind of counteract the psycho kind of protections that the Army Ranger staff has put on Lee Price. Whatever. I don't really care about that explanation, but I like the kind of combative nature of this relationship and not necessarily the symbiotic relationship. So definitely a really cool book. I think it's going to be interesting when we find out where Flash Thompson went and how he lost the Venom symbiote, because that's a really important part of this story that I hope they touch on. But right now, I'm okay with the relationship and where they're kind of pushing this character. It looks like it's going to be pretty interesting. Another really interesting story is Thanos #2. So Thanos is continuing his search across the universe for a cure for his ultimately incurable disease. If we had to describe it, Mentor, I think, put it as like a god cancer. So it's just like, okay, Jeff Lemire, I'm not giving you points for that one, because it's just like, how do you explain this kind of molecular breakdown of an individual character? Like, he existed outside of Eternity for quite some time, you know, after Secret Wars, until he got pulled back in by the Ultimates after the rip in space. So Thanos has been exposed to some nasty-ass stuff. But what it comes down to is, like, I would have appreciated it might be, like, a different kind of explanation for that, but Thanos is still a giant ball of rage and power that's out there going to destroy everything. We do see the kind of grouping of every individual. So we've got Star Fox, we've got Trico, the champion of the universe, we've got Nebula actually making her way into the team, you've got Thane, but he didn't introduce Mistress Death into this whole situation, so they kind of have their roundtable discussion and they decide that they need to steal something from Terex the Terrible, who is also a member of the Cabal and all that kind of stuff. So this is going to be a really interesting story. I like where it's going, and I like the fact that Thanos is fighting against something that he can't control. He can't just simply overpower, you know, either intellectually or physically, and that's really kind of a cool concept. But he needs to survive, so how does he do it? That's my big question. A book that leaves me with some unanswered questions, though, is Ultimate Squared #2. So Ultimate Squared by Al Ewing, this is kind of an interesting book because it gives me a little bit of backstory that I don't really have a whole heck of a lot of knowledge on. So we see this kind of space snow entity make its way into the ship of Galactus, while Galactus is unfortunately at a meeting with the Living Tribunal, Lord Order, and Lord Chaos, in the highest plane of recognition inside the universe. Then we see this kind of entity who was a remnant of a creator, like a ghost of one of the original creators and manipulators of a version of the Marvel Universe. So if you think about it like the Matrix, like this is the 27th time that we've destroyed Zion, like that kind of situation. This is the same situation with the Marvel Universe. Like evidently Galactus is a remnant of the 7th creation going into the 8th, which is where we're at now. So that's kind of interesting, like the Living Tribunal himself has said that there's multiple creations and he is the one continuing factor over all of these things. Until something happens to him. But I don't want to spoil that too much for you guys, but Ultimates is definitely a really cool book. I don't necessarily like the portrayal of this whole higher plane, like Chaos, Order, Tribunal. That art kind of got a little funky on me. It didn't necessarily appeal to me the way that Rocafort's art did for that, but I really like the concept behind it. I like the story behind it. Very interesting. Highly recommend the Ultimate Squared #2, and the Ultimate Squared in general. Really cool series if you want to know more about the cosmic Marvel landscape. But now we're at the new #1s for the week, and the one that I want to talk about first is Justice League vs. Suicide Squad #1. So this is written by Joshua Williamson, and this first issue has art by Jason Fabik. This is pretty cool. So as a not fan of Justice League so far, as well as Suicide Squad so far, I wasn't really excited about going into this event. However, I like the setup, I like the premise, I like the way that everything's structured, and I think that for an event itself, I think the main storyline is going to be really good because you're going to have one continuous voice of Joshua Williamson, but have different artists that are going to kind of take this on. I'm a little worried about the idea that the Justice League and the superheroes of the world don't necessarily know that the Suicide Squad exists, simply because it's just like there are so many instances where the Suicide Squad has been taking care of business in the shadows where they couldn't help but do those things. And then it's just like, as soon as Batman mentions a possible connection with Amanda Waller and then like 2 or more incarcerated villains teaming up, and Cyborg's just like, okay, I have all the iterations and I just got an alert that they're at this island. It's just like, that is how simple it would have been, right? It's like, all they had to do was put 2 and 2 together, and they were always like, what is 2 plus 2? I don't know. Let me ponder on that a little bit. But overall, if we're talking about a book that's probably going to be a lot of big spectacle, a lot of fun, and then there's this kind of shadowy secondary villain situation. So we're going to get the villains fighting the superheroes, and then we're going to get the villains and the superheroes fighting the real villains. So that's going to be pretty interesting too. I've got a little bit more hope for this one, but we're going to see where issue #2 goes to see if that hope is justified. And to finish things off, let's talk about Gamora #1. So Gamora #1 is actually what I kind of expected, and this is really an origin story-ish kind of portrayal of Gamora. And this is written by Nicole Perlman, who also wrote the Guardians of the Galaxy screenplay with James Gunn. And this is really cool. I really like this portrayal of Gamora. I like her relationship with Nebula. I like her relationship with Thanos. And this is a really good take on this character. It feels really fun. It feels like there's going to be a position to get invested in Gamora because she's very much a reluctant minion or a reluctant ward of Thanos. She goes about and does these kind of things. She's 18 years old and she gets to absolutely wreak havoc on the Badoon who destroyed all of her people. She was the last of her race, and now it's her hunt for the last piece of that culture that she just destroyed on her 18th birthday. You've got the relationship between Gamora and Thanos, the relationship between Gamora and Nebula, and the relationship between Thanos and Nebula, and like this whole family triangle is really complicated and really screwed up, and I really enjoy it. So I'm really excited to see where Gamora #1 goes, and that's something that I probably didn't expect myself to say when I started looking at it on Monday. This is definitely a very interesting book, one that I say that people should be keeping their eye out on, especially if you're a Guardians of the Galaxy fan. So those are all the books that I picked up this week, but I want to know what you guys grabbed too, so hit me up in the comments down below and we can start that conversation, see if there's anything else that I should go back to the shop and grab. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe right there to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.